The transformation from a troubled youth into a cold-blooded killer didn't happen overnight. It was a process, one that began in the dark corners of his childhood and slowly evolved as he grew older. By the time he reached adulthood, the rage that had been simmering inside him for years had fully taken shape. He was no longer just a boy trying to survive a brutal home. He was a man looking for a way to assert his power, and he found it in the most horrifying way possible, through murder. His first acts of violence weren't calculated. They were fueled by anger, by an uncontrollable need to release the fury that had built up inside him for so long. At first, his victims were those who had wronged him, bullies, disrespectful strangers, anyone who dared to challenge his authority. The first time he took a life, something inside him changed. Where most people would feel guilt, remorse, or even hesitation, he felt something entirely different: satisfaction. A sense of control. For the first time, he was the one deciding who lived and who died, and that power was intoxicating. He quickly learned that he had a natural ability for violence. He wasn't reckless or sloppy, he was methodical. Unlike others who might lash out in a fit of rage and later regret it, he took his time. He planned. He observed. He became a predator in the truest sense, studying his targets, figuring out the perfect moment to strike. He wasn't just killing to satisfy his anger anymore, he was perfecting his craft. His early crimes caught the attention of the criminal underworld. The mafia, always on the lookout for those willing to do their dirty work, saw potential in him. He wasn't just a thug looking to make a name for himself, he was different. He had patience. He had discipline. He had the cold detachment required to carry out executions without hesitation. And most importantly, he was willing to do whatever was necessary without asking questions. The transition from random acts of violence to contract killing was seamless for him. The mob took him under their wing, providing him with the resources and connections to turn his deadly skills into a full-fledged career. He didn't just work for one family, he worked for multiple crime organizations, making himself an invaluable asset in the world of organized crime. If someone needed to disappear, he was the one to call. He had no loyalty to any single organization, only to the job itself. What made him so dangerous was not just his ability to kill, but the way he did it. He was not reckless, not messy. He didn't leave behind trails of evidence or act out of impulse. Every job was carefully planned, every move calculated. He adapted his methods depending on the situation, using guns, knives, poisons, or even his bare hands when necessary. He didn't just kill his victims. He ensured that their deaths were untraceable, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to link him to the crimes. His reputation grew. Whispers spread through the underworld about a man who could kill without remorse, who never left loose ends, who could walk up to a target, execute them, and vanish without a trace. He was feared not just for what he did, but for how effortlessly he did it. Despite the countless murders he committed, he remained invisible to law enforcement for years. He was careful, meticulous, always covering his tracks. He knew that the moment he became careless, the moment he left behind even the smallest piece of evidence, it would all come crashing down. And so, he operated in the shadows, eliminating anyone who posed a threat to his work, ensuring that no one could betray him. But the rise of a killer is never the end of the story. The more powerful he became, the more bodies he left behind, and the closer he came to the one thing he had always managed to avoid, getting caught. To understand what made him one of the most feared contract killers in history, one must examine the way he carried out his deadly work. Unlike impulsive criminals who acted on emotion, he approached every murder with precision, adaptability, and a chilling level of detachment. He did not have just one preferred method of execution. He had many. Each killing was carefully planned, and the technique he used depended on the situation, the target, and, sometimes, just his own curiosity. He mastered a variety of weapons, each serving a different purpose. Firearms were the most common tool in the world of organized crime, and he had no shortage of them. He could walk up to a target in broad daylight, fire a single shot to the head, and disappear into the crowd before anyone realized what had happened. But he wasn't just another gunman. He was an artist of death, always seeking new and inventive ways to eliminate his victims. Knives were another weapon in his arsenal, used when silence was required. A quick thrust to the ribs, a deep cut to the throat, clean, efficient, and deadly. He knew the human body well, understanding exactly where to strike for a fast kill or, if necessary, a slow and painful one. Strangulation was also a common method, particularly when he needed to eliminate someone without drawing attention. A rope, a wire, even his bare hands, whatever the situation called for, he was prepared. But what truly set him apart from other hitmen was his use of poison. Many killers relied on brute force, but he was different. He had a fascination with chemicals, experimenting with cyanide and other lethal substances to dispatch his victims in ways that left little evidence behind. He could slip poison into a drink, inject it into food, or even spray it onto a victim's skin. One of his most disturbing techniques involved using a spray bottle filled with cyanide, which allowed him to kill a person in seconds without leaving any physical marks. This method was nearly impossible to trace, making it a favorite of his when he wanted a victim's death to appear natural. Freezing bodies was another gruesome trick he used to evade law enforcement. By storing corpses in industrial freezers, he was able to delay decomposition, making it impossible for forensic experts to determine the exact time of death. This tactic earned him his infamous nickname, as it allowed him to dispose of bodies in ways that confused investigators. A body found months after a murder, still appearing freshly killed, was a puzzle that law enforcement struggled to solve. He didn't just kill for money. He studied his craft, experimented with new techniques, and refined his skills over time. Some victims were shot, some were poisoned, and others were beaten to death, each method tailored to the specific job. To him, murder wasn't just about eliminating a target. It was about perfecting the process, ensuring that no two killings were ever exactly alike. Unlike many killers who develop a pattern, he made sure that he had none. Some victims were left in dumpsters, others buried, and some never found at all. He adapted his methods to avoid detection, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to connect his crimes. He was a master of deception, ensuring that each murder appeared to be the result of different circumstances. Some deaths looked like robberies gone wrong, others like accidents, and some like natural causes. His ability to disguise his killings kept him one step ahead of investigators for decades. He also took advantage of technology and forensic science, understanding how to avoid leaving DNA or fingerprints behind. He wore gloves, used disposable weapons, and meticulously cleaned crime scenes. His awareness of investigative techniques made him incredibly difficult to track, allowing him to operate in the shadows without leaving a trace. What made him especially terrifying was his complete lack of hesitation. He could take a life in an instant, without second-guessing, without remorse. There was no emotional connection, no moral struggle, just a job to be done. Whether it was a quick gunshot or a slow poisoning, it made no difference to him. His victims were simply assignments, obstacles to be removed with whatever method was most effective at the time. Through years of practice, he became one of the most versatile and unpredictable killers in criminal history. His ability to adapt, to change his methods, and to cover his tracks made him nearly untouchable. But even the most careful killers eventually make mistakes, and for all his precision and cunning, his time in the shadows would not last forever. There are many words that could describe him: ruthless, emotionless, efficient, but none capture his chilling nature as perfectly as the nickname he earned, the Iceman. This title wasn't just a reference to his cold demeanor, it was rooted in the terrifying method he used to cover up his crimes. He didn't just kill people, he made sure their bodies told no story, their deaths remained mysteries, and their disappearances left nothing but unanswered questions. Unlike most contract killers, who disposed of their victims immediately, he took an entirely different approach. He understood forensic science better than most criminals. He knew that law enforcement could determine the time of death by examining the state of a corpse, and he was smart enough to use this knowledge against them. To throw off investigators, he developed a method that set him apart from all other killers. He froze the bodies of his victims. By placing the corpses in industrial freezers, sometimes for months at a time, he ensured that when they were eventually discovered, the usual forensic techniques could not accurately determine when they had been killed. The bodies would appear freshly dead, even though the murders had taken place long before. This tactic created confusion for detectives and coroners alike, making it nearly impossible to trace the crime back to him. This was not the behavior of an impulsive murder. This was the work of someone who treated killing like a science, precise, calculated, and methodical. He didn't kill out of emotion. He didn't make mistakes. Every murder was planned, every detail considered, every trace of evidence erased before anyone even realized what had happened. His ability to remain calm in any situation was what made him even more terrifying. He could kill a person, walk away, and go home to his family as if nothing had happened. He could hold conversations with people who had no idea that just hours before, he had ended a life. There was no guilt, no hesitation, just an unshakable composure that made him nearly impossible to detect. Even when under pressure, he never lost his cool. There were moments when his crime should have caught up with him, when he should have made a mistake, but he didn't. His ability to lie, to manipulate, and to adapt to any situation kept him ahead of those trying to catch him. He could sit across from detectives, answer their questions, and show no sign of nervousness, no crack in his icy exterior. To him, human life held no value. He could take it as easily as flipping a switch, without remorse, without hesitation. He didn't see his victims as people with families, dreams, or futures. They were simply obstacles, jobs that needed to be completed with precision and efficiency. And he did so without the slightest emotional attachment. The nickname the Iceman was fitting not just because of the way he preserved bodies, but because of his personality itself. He was cold in every sense of the word, unfeeling, detached, and completely devoid of empathy. He operated in a way that made it clear he had no regard for life, no moral struggle, no second thoughts. He was a man who had mastered the art of killing, refining it like a craft, and perfecting it over decades. His ability to separate his crimes from his personal life made him even more dangerous. He could commit a brutal murder, then return home and act like a normal father and husband. He could sit at the dinner table, eat with his family, and laugh at jokes, as if he hadn't just ended someone's existence hours before. The people closest to him never suspected a thing, never saw through the mask he wore so effortlessly. But no matter how careful he was, no matter how well he covered his tracks, even the coldest, most calculated killers eventually make mistakes. And when they do, the consequences are inevitable. For most people who knew him, he was just another man trying to make a living. A husband, a father, a neighbor. To those around him, he appeared as an ordinary family man, someone who worked hard to provide for his wife and children. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where families gathered for barbecues, children played outside, and life seemed peaceful. But beneath this seemingly normal exterior was a dark secret, one that his family, friends, and neighbors had no idea about. He wasn't just working long hours at a regular job. He wasn't just another man dealing with the stresses of everyday life. When he left home in the morning, he wasn't going to an office or a factory. He was carrying out contract killings, eliminating targets for the mob, and ensuring that no one would ever connect him to his crimes. He was living a double life, balancing the role of a loving family man with that of a cold-blooded assassin. His wife and children never suspected a thing. To them, he was a provider, a man who worked tirelessly to ensure they had everything they needed. He took his children to school, attended their events, and spent time with them as if nothing was out of the ordinary. His wife believed he was simply a hardworking man, and although he had a temper, she never imagined the extent of what he was capable of. But there were moments, small glimpses of the real man behind the mask. His violent outbursts, though rare, were intense. When he was angry, he was terrifying. His family learned never to challenge him, never to push him too far. There were times when his wife saw something in his eyes, something cold, something dangerous, but she never fully understood what it meant. Despite his violent tendencies, he was careful to keep his two lives separate. He never discussed his work, never allowed his family to see the darkness that lurked beneath his calm demeanor. He came home each night as if he had spent the day doing normal work, never letting on that only hours before he had taken another life. He hid his crimes so well that even those closest to him never suspected the truth. He had an uncanny ability to switch between roles. One moment, he was a ruthless killer, showing no mercy as he carried out executions. The next, he was sitting at the dinner table with his family, asking about their day as if nothing had happened. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. How could someone commit such brutal acts and then return home to be a loving father? How could a man who took lives so easily also tuck his children into bed at night? The secret to his success was control. He controlled his emotions, his actions, and his reactions. He never allowed his two worlds to collide, ensuring that no part of his criminal life bled into his personal one. He was meticulous in covering his tracks, never bringing home any evidence, never speaking about his work, never making a mistake that could expose his true nature. Even when law enforcement began to investigate him, his family remained unaware. Detectives and investigators began to suspect he was involved in criminal activities, but those who knew him personally refused to believe it. How could this man, a man who took his children to school, who spent weekends with his family, who lived an ordinary suburban life, be the monster they were looking for? But no matter how well he maintained the illusion, no matter how perfectly he balanced his double life, the truth was always there, hidden just beneath the surface. And the longer he kept up the act, the closer he came to the moment when his two worlds would inevitably collide. For a man like him, fear was more than just a weapon. It was a tool of control, a means of ensuring obedience, and a guarantee that no one would ever dare to cross him. He didn't just rely on brute force to eliminate threats. He used psychological warfare, making sure that people feared him long before he ever had to lift a finger. His reputation alone was enough to keep most people in line, and those who doubted his willingness to act quickly learned that their skepticism was a fatal mistake. From an early age, he understood that power came not just from what a person could do, but from what others believed they could do. He cultivated an image of himself as someone who was completely without mercy, someone who would not hesitate to kill if given the slightest reason. This reputation was built on real actions, brutal, violent, and often public displays of what happened to those who disrespected or betrayed him. One of his most chilling traits was his ability to remain completely calm in the face of violence. While others might show anger or emotion, he kept his composure, delivering threats in a level, almost casual tone that made them even more terrifying. There was no shouting, no dramatic gestures, just an unshakable certainty that whatever he promised, he would carry out. And once he made a threat, there was no going back. He had no tolerance for disrespect. If someone failed him, betrayed him, or even so much as looked at him the wrong way, he ensured that they paid the price. Sometimes, the punishment was immediate, a quick and brutal death that served as an example to others. Other times, he let the fear build, making the target know what was coming but not when it would happen. This psychological torment was often worse than the act itself, as the victims spent their final days consumed by paranoia, never knowing when the end would come. He also had no patience for weakness. He despised those who begged for their lives, who pleaded for mercy. To him, this was pathetic, a sign that they were unworthy of survival. He didn't grant second chances, didn't forgive mistakes. Once someone was marked for death, their fate was sealed. The way he instilled fear wasn't just limited to his enemies. Those closest to him felt it too. His associates, the men who worked alongside him, knew better than to question his authority. They followed his orders without hesitation, not out of loyalty, but out of sheer terror. They had seen what happened to those who disobeyed. They knew that crossing him, even in the slightest way, meant certain death. Even his family, though unaware of the full extent of his crimes, could sense the danger that lurked beneath his surface. His wife and children learned to tread carefully around him, avoiding anything that might set off his temper. He didn't need to raise his voice to make his presence felt. His mere existence was enough to create an atmosphere of silent, unspoken fear. His ability to intimidate extended beyond the criminal underworld. Even law enforcement officers who crossed paths with him felt uneasy in his presence. There was something about him, something in his eyes, that made people hesitate. He had the ability to look someone in the eye and make them feel as though they were already dead. Detectives who interviewed him later recalled that he had an unnatural calmness, an eerie detachment that set him apart from any other criminal they had encountered. It wasn't just that he was a killer, it was that he was unafraid of anything. He had no fear of prison, no fear of death, no fear of consequences. This made him incredibly dangerous because there was nothing anyone could do to intimidate him in return. He was the one who dictated the rules, the one who decided who lived and who died, and he made sure that everyone around him knew it. But no man, no matter how feared, can escape the consequences of his actions forever. And for someone who had spent decades ruling through fear and intimidation, the moment when his power began to slip away was bound to be just as brutal as the legacy he had built. For years, law enforcement agencies had been aware of a shadowy figure operating in the criminal underworld, an elusive hitman who seemed to leave no trace, no witnesses, and no evidence. Bodies appeared, but leads went cold. Murders were committed, but there were no suspects. Investigators knew they were dealing with a highly intelligent and methodical killer, someone who was unlike the typical criminals they encountered. But despite their best efforts, this ghost-like assassin remained untouchable. The problem was that there was no clear pattern, no single thread that connected the crimes. Each murder was carried out in a different way. Some were executed with gunshots, others were poisoned, some were beaten to death, and others simply vanished without a trace. To detectives, it seemed as if multiple killers were at work. There was no forensic evidence left behind, no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses who could provide a useful description. It was as if the murderer was always one step ahead, erasing any sign of his presence before investigators could even begin their search. The criminal organizations that employed him were no help to law enforcement. The mafia families that had relied on his services for years knew the value of silence. In their world, speaking to the police meant certain death, and no one was willing to risk their life by providing information about a man they feared more than the law itself. His name was spoken only in hushed whispers, and even those who had worked with him directly knew better than to reveal anything about him. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine knowing someone for years, perhaps a friendly neighbor, a devoted family man, or even just an unassuming figure in your community, only to later discover that beneath the surface, this person was hiding one of the darkest secrets imaginable. That was the reality of the man we discussed today. To those who encountered him in daily life, he was quiet, reserved, and largely unremarkable. He wasn't the type to draw attention to himself. He didn't engage in loud conversations, nor did he seem to have a particularly noticeable presence. But this was all by design. He lived his life in a way that allowed him to blend in perfectly. He drove his children to school. He attended family barbecues. He smiled at cashiers at the grocery store and made small talk with his neighbors. From the outside, his life appeared utterly normal, perhaps even mundane. But this was merely a carefully maintained facade, a mask that concealed the true nature of the man beneath. Behind closed doors and in the shadows of society, he was a different person entirely. He lived a double life so seamlessly that even those closest to him never suspected a thing. He didn't just fool acquaintances and distant relatives. He managed to deceive the very people who should have known him best, his own wife and children. They believed he was a hardworking man, often away on business, sacrificing long hours to provide a better life for them. In reality, those business trips were something else entirely. He understood the power of appearances. He knew that the best way to stay undetected was to act as if there was nothing unusual about him. He didn't dress extravagantly. He didn't live in a lavish mansion that would raise suspicion. He presented himself as a man living an ordinary life, never allowing anyone to glimpse what was hidden beneath that exterior. But what made him truly terrifying was not just his ability to lie, it was how convincingly he did it. He never hesitated, never showed cracks in his act. Even when confronted with law enforcement, he remained calm, his face betraying nothing. It was this eerie sense of control that made him one of the most elusive figures in criminal history. This wasn't a story of a man who made a single bad decision or got caught up in the wrong crowd. No, this was someone who meticulously maintained a dual existence for decades. He was living proof that the most dangerous people aren't always the ones who look the part. Sometimes, the most ruthless figures are the ones standing quietly beside us, hiding in plain sight. Every story has a beginning, and in this case, it starts in a place where violence was not just present, it was a way of life. The childhood of this man was anything but ordinary. Born into a home filled with fear, pain, and relentless cruelty, he never experienced the warmth and security that most children take for granted. Instead, he was thrust into an environment where survival meant learning to endure suffering, and where love was replaced with fear. His father was an abusive man, a figure of terror rather than protection. He ruled the household with an iron fist, meting out brutal punishments without hesitation. Beatings were not occasional. They were a regular part of life, a twisted routine that left deep scars, both physical and emotional. His mother, though also a victim of this harsh world, was strict and deeply religious, instilling discipline through her own form of harsh treatment. There was no tenderness, no comfort, only the rigid expectation that obedience must be absolute. From an early age, he learned that showing emotion was a weakness. Crying only invited more punishment. Seeking comfort led to rejection. The safest way to exist in that household was to remain silent, to hide every feeling behind a cold, expressionless face. Over time, this survival tactic became second nature. He did not flinch, did not beg for mercy. He simply endured. And in enduring, he transformed. As he grew older, his anger and resentment built up, festering inside him like an infection. But rather than break him, it hardened him. He made a decision, perhaps subconsciously at first, that he would never be the victim again. He would never allow himself to feel powerless the way he did as a child. And so, when the opportunity came to exert control over others, to become the one who instilled fear instead of feeling it, he embraced it without hesitation. The streets became his escape, a place where he could channel his pent-up rage. While other children played games and enjoyed the carefree days of youth, he was already shaping into something else. He sought out power, not through friendships or achievements, but through dominance and brutality. He learned early on that violence wasn't just an outlet, it was a tool, a way to command respect, a way to ensure that no one could ever hurt him again. School was of little importance to him. He wasn't interested in learning from textbooks or sitting in a classroom where rules dictated behavior. The real lessons he valued were learned elsewhere, in the back alleys, in the fights he started and won, in the fear he began to see in the eyes of others. This was where he thrived, where he felt truly in control for the first time in his life. By the time he was a teenager, he had already committed acts of extreme violence. It wasn't just about defending himself anymore, it was about making sure that he was the one people feared. He had been powerless for too long, and now, he was determined to reverse the roles. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was evolving. His early life didn't just shape him, it created him. The boy who had once been helpless and afraid was long gone, replaced by someone entirely different. Someone who would go on to live a life that most could never imagine. Someone who had been raised in the dark and now carried that darkness within him, ready to unleash it upon the world. But as the bodies piled up, authorities became more determined than ever to bring this invisible assassin to justice. They began to look deeper, connecting cases that had once seemed unrelated. They reviewed old files, re-examined crime scenes, and searched for any inconsistencies that might reveal a pattern. Slowly, a picture began to form, a list of victims, a timeline of events, and small but significant details that pointed to a single individual. Still, they lacked the evidence needed to make an arrest. They needed someone from the inside, someone who had seen this man operate firsthand. But who would dare to betray him? Who would be willing to risk their life to expose a killer who had built a reputation on eliminating anyone who got in his way? Their breakthrough finally came when they found an informant, someone who had been close enough to witness the murders, but far enough removed to see the cracks in his perfect facade. This informant, motivated by fear, revenge, or self-preservation, provided crucial details about the assassin's methods, his contacts, and his movements. For the first time, law enforcement had a lead that could bring them closer to their target. Surveillance was put in place. Every step he took was watched. Phone calls were monitored. His financial transactions were tracked. Investigators studied his routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But they knew they had to be careful. One wrong move, one sign that he was being watched, and he would disappear. He had survived for decades without being caught, and if he realized that the net was closing around him, he would undoubtedly find a way to escape once again. It was a game of patience, a slow and methodical hunt for a man who had spent his life evading capture. Detectives and agents worked around the clock, piecing together decades of unsolved murders, gathering testimony from those who had once been too afraid to speak. Each new piece of information brought them closer to their target, each clue reinforcing the horrifying reality of what he had done. The hunt was no longer just about solving individual murders. It was about bringing down a man who had operated in the shadows for far too long. It was about ending the reign of a killer who had believed himself to be untouchable. And as law enforcement closed in, as the walls began to tighten around him, the question was no longer if he would be caught, but when. After years of dead ends, law enforcement knew that traditional methods wouldn't be enough to take him down. He was too careful, too experienced, and too aware of how to avoid detection. Investigators needed a different approach, one that would catch him off guard, force him into a situation where he couldn't manipulate the outcome. A direct arrest wouldn't work. They needed him to incriminate himself. And so, they devised a plan, a sting operation that would leave him with no escape. The operation was designed to be foolproof. Law enforcement agents carefully constructed an undercover scenario that would lure him in, making him believe he was dealing with trusted associates rather than police operatives. They had gathered enough intelligence to understand his habits, his preferences, and the way he conducted business. He never took jobs from just anyone. He only worked with those he trusted. That meant the key to the sting was finding someone already within his circle, someone who could convince him that this was just another job, another hit, no different from the countless others he had carried out before. This was where the informant became invaluable. He was someone from the criminal underworld who had once worked closely with him, someone who had witnessed his work firsthand. This informant, now cooperating with the authorities, was given the dangerous task of drawing him into the trap. It had to be done carefully. One wrong move, one sign of deception, and the entire operation would fall apart. Worse, the informant's life would be in immediate danger. Through carefully planned conversations, the informant introduced the idea of a lucrative contract killing, a job that would require the assassin's expertise. The target, the scenario, the details, it was all fabricated, designed to make him comfortable enough to discuss his methods. Unbeknownst to him, every word was being recorded, every move monitored. At first, he was cautious. He asked questions, tested the waters, ensuring that everything seemed legitimate. He had spent decades avoiding law enforcement, and he wasn't about to walk into a trap without thorough scrutiny. But the informant played his role perfectly, providing reassurances, subtly dropping names of past associates, and creating an illusion that was impossible to doubt. Slowly, he began to relax. He started discussing logistics, how he would carry out the hit, what method he would use, how he would dispose of the body. It was exactly what law enforcement had been waiting for. With every word, he unknowingly sealed his fate, providing irrefutable evidence that he was not just a suspect but an active, calculating killer. Once investigators had enough recorded proof, they didn't act immediately. They waited, allowing him to incriminate himself further. He spoke about past jobs, confirming details that had puzzled detectives for years. He described methods that aligned perfectly with unsolved murders. He unknowingly connected himself to crimes that had long been mysteries. When law enforcement finally moved in, it was swift and calculated, just like the man they were capturing. They had built an airtight case, ensuring that there was no room for escape, no possibility of denial. When the moment came, they arrested him in a way that left him no chance to react, no opportunity to run. The man who had spent decades living in the shadows, eluding justice, suddenly found himself in the very position he had always avoided, caught, exposed, and with nowhere left to hide. But even as he sat in custody, surrounded by officers who had spent years hunting him, his demeanor remained unchanged. He did not panic. He did not beg. He did not show fear. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, he maintained the same cold, unshaken presence that had defined him for decades. But for the first time in his life, he was no longer in control of the situation. For the first time, someone else held the power. And as the reality of his capture settled in, the world would finally begin to uncover the full extent of the horrors he had committed. The moment he was brought into the interrogation room, the atmosphere shifted. The detectives who had spent years chasing him now sat across from the man they had only known as a ghost, a killer who had evaded justice for decades. They had studied his crimes, dissected his methods, and listened to hours of his recorded conversations. But now, they were face to face with the man himself, and they knew this wouldn't be a normal interrogation. Unlike most criminals, he wasn't nervous. He wasn't aggressive either. He sat there, calm and composed, his expression unreadable. There was no sign of fear, no desperation to escape, no anger at being caught. If anything, it was as if he was observing them, studying their movements, reading their intentions just as they were trying to do with him. It was a game, and he wasn't about to make it easy for them. The detectives began with routine questions: his name, his background, details about his life. He answered without hesitation, offering only the basic information. He was careful with his words, giving nothing away. He wasn't about to confess, and he certainly wasn't going to crack under pressure. But the investigators weren't relying on traditional interrogation tactics. They had spent too long preparing for this moment, analyzing his psychological profile, anticipating how he would react. They knew that intimidation wouldn't work. He had lived a life where fear was his weapon, not theirs. Instead, they took a different approach. They brought up his past crimes, one by one, laying out the evidence they had compiled. They played recordings of his own words, the conversations where he had unknowingly admitted to his methods. They presented crime scene photos, linking them to his statements, showing him that they knew far more than he had anticipated. At first, he didn't react. He leaned back in his chair, listening, occasionally smirking as if amused by their attempts to break him. But the detectives didn't stop. They continued pressing, showing him how carefully they had pieced together his criminal history. They reminded him of the victims, people whose names he had long forgotten, whose deaths had been nothing more than routine jobs to him. For the first time, there was a shift, a flicker of something in his expression, perhaps amusement, perhaps pride. He wasn't afraid of being caught. If anything, he seemed almost intrigued by how much they had uncovered. It was as if he had spent so long in the shadows that finally being seen, finally having his work recognized, was a new experience for him. Then came the moment of truth. The detectives gave him a choice: deny everything and face an uphill battle in court, or talk. Tell them what they already knew, fill in the gaps, and at least control the narrative of his own story. They weren't asking for remorse. They knew he had none. They weren't expecting an apology. They just wanted the truth, the full truth, from the only man who could tell it. And that was when he began to speak. Not because he was forced to, not because he was broken, but because he wanted to. He knew he had lost the game. There was no escape, no loophole, no way to walk free. But if he couldn't control his freedom, he could at least control his legacy. And so, for the first time, he started revealing details, stories that even the detectives hadn't uncovered, murders that had never been linked to him, secrets that had remained buried for years. It wasn't a confession in the traditional sense. There was no regret, no guilt in his voice. He spoke about murder as if he were describing a business transaction, recalling each kill with perfect clarity. He didn't exaggerate, didn't attempt to justify his actions. He simply told the facts, emotionless and detached. The detectives listened, horrified yet fascinated. They had spent years trying to understand the mind of this man, and now, sitting before them, was the unfiltered truth. He wasn't a man consumed by rage or passion. He wasn't a killer driven by impulse. He was simply methodical, a man who had perfected the art of taking lives with the same precision as a craftsman perfecting his trade. And as the hours passed, as the stories unfolded, as the sheer scale of his crimes became clear, one thing was undeniable. They weren't just dealing with a criminal. They were face to face with a man who had lived his entire life in a world devoid of empathy, a man who had built a career on death and deception. But even as he spoke, even as he detailed the horrifying extent of his crimes, the question remained, was this the full truth, or was he still holding something back? And if he was, what other secrets had he taken with him into that interrogation room, never to be revealed? As he sat across from the detectives, the weight of his own words settling into the room, the true horror of his actions began to take shape. He wasn't just admitting to a handful of murders, he was recounting them in graphic, chilling detail. And yet, there was no emotion in his voice, no hesitation, no remorse. He spoke about each kill as if he were discussing a mundane task, as if ending a life was no different from taking out the trash or running an errand. At first, his confessions aligned with the cases investigators had already linked to him, murders they had long suspected but had never been able to prove. But then he began revealing more. Names that had never been on their radar. Victims who had never been identified. Killings that had never even been classified as homicides. Each revelation peeled back another layer of the mystery that had surrounded him for years. He spoke about the variety of methods he had used. The poisons that left no trace. The gunshots that were fired from just the right angle to mimic suicides. The brutal beatings that ensured the victims were unrecognizable. The bodies that were disposed of so efficiently that no evidence was ever found. He had perfected the art of killing, adapting to every situation, ensuring that no two crimes looked the same. His words were not filled with pride, but they weren't filled with guilt either. He recounted each event with the precision of a man who had spent years refining his craft. To him, killing wasn't an emotional act, it was a calculated decision, a necessary step to eliminate problems, settle scores, or fulfill contracts. The detectives listened in stunned silence as he detailed how he had studied his targets, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had watched them for days, weeks even, until he knew exactly when they would be alone, vulnerable, unsuspecting. Some he had killed quickly, efficiently. Others he had toyed with, prolonging their suffering, watching the fear grow in their eyes before delivering the final blow. But what disturbed the investigators the most was his complete lack of empathy. When asked if he regretted any of it, he simply shrugged. Regret was a foreign concept to him. To regret something, one had to see it as wrong, and he didn't. He had lived by his own rules, followed his own moral code, a code that had no room for remorse, no space for compassion. He even spoke about the times he had killed without being paid to do so. The moments where anger, disrespect, or even mild annoyance had led him to take a life. A man who had cut him off in traffic. A stranger who had looked at him the wrong way. A minor slight that had escalated into an act of finality. The power he held over life and death had become so ingrained in him that killing was no longer just business. It was instinct. As the confessions continued, investigators began to realize just how many lives had been affected by this one man. Families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Cases that had gone cold. Detectives who had retired without ever finding closure. And now, sitting in that room, was the answer to all of it. As the trial neared its end, the weight of justice pressed down on the courtroom. The evidence had been overwhelming, the testimonies damning, and the confessions chilling. There was no question about his guilt, only the matter of how severe his punishment would be. The prosecutors demanded the maximum sentence, arguing that a man who had taken so many lives with such cold precision deserved no mercy. The defense, though left with little to fight for, attempted to argue that his upbringing and environment had shaped him into what he had become. But the jury saw past it. When the judge prepared to deliver the sentence, the entire courtroom fell silent. The families of victims sat in tense anticipation, waiting for the final word that would give them some semblance of closure. The media leaned forward, eager to capture the moment justice was served. But amidst all this, there was one person who remained utterly unchanged: him. As the judge spoke, listing his crimes in meticulous detail, his expression did not shift. He showed no regret, no remorse, no sign that he was affected by the weight of his own actions. While most criminals facing life imprisonment or worse might plead, break down, or show signs of emotion, he sat still, his eyes focused forward, as if he were simply an observer in someone else's trial. When the final verdict was delivered, multiple life sentences with no chance of parole, there was a mix of reactions in the courtroom. Some of the victims' families wept, finally feeling that justice had been served. Others remained stoic, knowing that no prison sentence could truly make up for what they had lost. The media scrambled to report the final ruling, solidifying his name in history as one of the most notorious criminals of his time. But he remained completely unfazed. There was no outburst, no visible anger, no plea for leniency. To him, it was just another moment, another inevitability in the path he had chosen long ago. If he feared death, he didn't show it. If he regretted his choices, he kept it buried deep within. Even as he was led away in shackles, he carried himself with the same eerie calmness that had defined him throughout his reign of terror. Some speculated that, in his mind, he had already accepted his fate long before the trial had even begun. He had lived his life on his own terms, making his own rules, deciding who lived and who died. Now, for the first time, he was no longer in control. But rather than fight it, rather than beg for mercy, he seemed almost indifferent, as if none of it truly mattered to him. Yet, even as the courtroom emptied and the world moved on to the next big story, one question continued to haunt those who had followed his case. Did he truly feel nothing? Or was there something hidden beneath that mask of indifference, something only he would ever understand? Prison was meant to be the great equalizer, the place where even the most hardened criminals found themselves powerless within the rigid confines of steel bars and unyielding rules. But for him, incarceration did not seem to bring the kind of suffering or remorse that people had hoped for. Instead, he adapted as he always had, watching, learning, and understanding the mechanics of his new world. From the moment he was processed, prison officials knew they were dealing with someone different. Unlike other inmates who entered the system with either fear or defiance, he carried himself with an eerie calmness, as if he were merely transitioning from one phase of his life to another. He did not lash out. He did not try to assert dominance. He did not beg for favors. Instead, he studied the environment around him, much like he had studied his victims, calculating how best to navigate this new reality. For many prisoners, the walls that confined them were a form of punishment, restricting their movements, stripping them of their freedom. But for him, confinement seemed almost irrelevant. He had spent much of his life in secrecy, operating in the shadows, keeping to himself unless necessary. Now, those same traits that had allowed him to evade capture for so long made prison life surprisingly manageable. He avoided conflicts when possible, not out of fear, but out of a sense of practicality. He had nothing to prove to the other inmates, no interest in gang politics or power struggles. Yet, at the same time, there was an unspoken understanding among those who shared his prison block. He was not someone to be crossed. Even without weapons, even without his former network of criminal contacts, there was something about him that sent a clear message: leave him alone. Guards and fellow prisoners alike were unnerved by his presence. His ability to sit in absolute stillness for hours, his refusal to engage in meaningless conversations, his unsettling way of making direct eye contact without blinking, all of it made him an anomaly. Some inmates tried to test him, to see if the stories were exaggerated, but those encounters ended quickly. A single icy stare, a subtle shift in body language, a few carefully chosen words, and the message was understood. He was not a man to be provoked. Despite the cold efficiency with which he had once carried out his crimes, he was not reckless in prison. He understood that violence within these walls could only lead to further restrictions, more surveillance, and, potentially, an earlier death. Instead, he maintained a low profile, following the rules when necessary, never drawing too much attention to himself. Yet, even in his silence, he remained one of the most feared men behind bars. Over time, he became somewhat of an enigma to those around him. Some guards watched him with caution, knowing full well what he was capable of. Others saw him as just another inmate, Another lifer with nowhere to go and nothing left to lose. But even as the years passed, there was one undeniable truth. He never changed. Unlike other criminals who, after years of confinement, sought redemption, expressed regret, or attempted to reform, he remained as emotionless and detached as the day he was arrested. There were no apologies, no breakdowns, no attempts to justify his actions. If he had any regrets, he kept them buried deep inside, never once letting the world see even a flicker of vulnerability. But despite his unshaken demeanor, there was always a lingering question. Was he truly at peace with his fate, or was there still some part of him that longed for the world beyond those bars? Was he content living out his days in a cage, or did he still dream of the power he once held? As the years passed, his legend remained intact, but his body began to betray him. Age and illness crept in, forcing even the most unbreakable man to acknowledge his mortality. He had spent his life controlling every aspect of his existence, eliminating those who stood in his way, navigating a world of shadows with ruthless precision. But there was one enemy he could not outmaneuver: time. Inside the prison walls, he remained as cold and detached as ever. His health declined, yet he never sought sympathy or showed fear. Even as sickness weakened him, his demeanor never changed. He refused to appear vulnerable, maintaining the same blank expression that had haunted investigators, prosecutors, and even fellow inmates for years. Doctors and prison officials monitored his condition, knowing that his time was running out. He had lived longer than many expected, but the inevitable was approaching. Some wondered if he would finally express regret, if the weight of his actions would press upon him in his final moments. But those who knew him best doubted it. He had never acknowledged guilt, never sought redemption, never asked for forgiveness. Why would he start now? Despite his declining state, there was one thing that remained constant: the mystery surrounding his true body count. He had confessed to numerous murders, detailed his methods with unsettling clarity, and admitted to crimes that had shocked even seasoned investigators. But everyone knew there was more. More victims, more names, more deaths that he had never spoken of. Even in prison, journalists, law enforcement, and true crime enthusiasts continued to dig, hoping to uncover the full extent of his crimes. But he gave nothing away. He let people speculate, let them question how many lives he had really taken. Some believed the number was far greater than what was recorded. Others thought he had exaggerated some of his claims, playing into his own legend. But the truth? The full truth? That was something only he knew. In his final weeks, there were whispers that authorities tried one last time to extract more information from him. Detectives who had spent decades chasing his ghost hoped that, in his weakened state, he might finally reveal his darkest secrets. Families of missing persons prayed that he would name just one more victim, give just one more clue that could bring closure to those who had spent years searching for answers. But he remained silent. Even as his body failed him, his mind remained sharp. He knew the power he still held, the knowledge that would die with him, and he seemed to relish that fact. It was his last act of control, his final move in a life filled with calculated decisions. As he lay in his prison bed, his breath becoming shallower, the walls around him closing in for the final time, the question lingered: how many secrets was he taking to the grave?